They say some prayers get lost in the asking, others find their way to exactly who needs to hear them. This is the story of a letter that was never supposed to arrive, a child who believed in miracles, and two broken hearts that found each other in the coldest winter Montana had ever seen. Winter arrived early in Montana territory that year, the kind of winter that stripped away pretense and left only truth. Snow fell thick and relentless, covering the land in a blanket of white that looked beautiful from a distance but felt cruel up close. In a cabin barely wider than a man could stretch his arms, a young widow knelt before a dying fire. Her name was Carla Welch. She was 29 years old, though the frontier had a way of adding years to a woman's face that calendars did not account for. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who could not afford wasted motion. She fed pine scraps into the hearth, watching the flames struggle to catch. The wood was damp. Everything was damp in this cabin. The walls leaked cold air through cracks she had stuffed with old fabric and mud. But winter always found new ways in. Behind her, in the single bed they shared, her daughter coughed. Carla froze. She counted the seconds between coughs the way other women counted blessings. 1, 2, 3, by 4, 5. 5 seconds was better than 3. 3 meant she would be up all night with steam treatments and prayers that seemed to bounce off the ceiling without reaching heaven. "I am fine, Mama," came a small voice from the bed. Carla stood and crossed the tiny room in 4 steps. She pressed the back of her hand to her daughter's forehead. Warm but not burning, not yet. Tinsley was 5 years old with light brown hair that curled at the ends and green eyes that noticed everything. She noticed when Carla skipped meals. She noticed when the firewood pile shrank too fast. She noticed other children laughing in ways that came easy because someone else carried part of their worry. "I know you are fine, sweetheart," Carla said, smoothing the thin blanket. "But you rest anyway." The cabin measured 12 feet by 14. 1 room, 1 bed, a table Carla had built herself from lumber she traded for a month of laundry work. 3 chairs, though only 2 ever got used anymore. Her husband Thomas had died 2 years ago. His horse spooked while crossing a river swollen with spring melt. They found him 3 miles downstream, still holding the reins. He had been a kind man, a gentle man, but not a practical one. He left her the cabin, $14, and a daughter who looked exactly like him. The $14 lasted 6 weeks. Carla learned quickly that the frontier did not soften for widows. She took in washing, she mended clothes, she cleaned cabins for families who could afford help. She hauled water from the creek even when ice formed at the edges thick enough to stand on. Her hands bore the evidence of lye soap and cold water. Rough, red, calloused across the palms. She was not beautiful in the way women in magazines were beautiful, but she carried herself with a dignity that made men remove their hats when she passed. She did not smile often anymore. Smiles required energy, and energy was already rationed. That night, after Tinsley fell asleep, Carla sat at the table with her accounting book. By candlelight, she added figures that never seemed to grow. Laundry brought in enough to buy cornmeal, salt pork, and lamp oil. Sometimes butter, rarely eggs, never meat. The Stein Ranch had offered her steady work, but it meant leaving Tinsley alone for full days. She would not do that, not with the coughing, not with winter pressing in like a living thing trying to get inside. She closed the book and stared at the candle flame until her eyes burned. Exhaustion lived in her bones now, permanent as marrow. But she did not cry. Crying was another luxury she could not afford. 15 miles northeast, in a ranch house built for a family but occupied by only one man, Vance Gilmore sat in a leather chair near a fireplace large enough to stand in. The room around him spoke of wealth earned through cattle, land deals, and years of careful management. Thick rugs covered pine floors. Shelves held books he actually read. The furniture was solid, imported, expensive, and every bit of it was silent. Vance was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of ranch work despite his wealth, dark hair that needed cutting, gray eyes that did not miss much but revealed even less. He had inherited the ranch from his father and expanded it through smart purchases when other men panicked during hard winters. He owned 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, and enough money that he could have lived in San Francisco if he wanted. He did not want cities. He wanted space, solitude, the kind of quiet where a man did not have to perform for anyone. He had been married once, briefly, 8 years ago. Rebecca had been a banker's daughter from Billings. Beautiful, refined. She imagined ranch life would be romantic. It was not. She left after 10 months, citing loneliness and boredom in equal measure. The divorce was civil. She remarried within a year. He had not. Since then, Vance had grown comfortable with his own company. He ate meals alone. He read alone. He slept in a bed built for two but occupied by one. He told himself he preferred it this way. People required explanations. Solitude required nothing. But lately, the silence had started to feel less like peace and more like absence. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at snow falling thick and steady. His reflection stared back at him. A successful man, a wealthy man, a man who had everything except someone to share it with. His childhood had been different from this. He grew up in a two-room shack in Wyoming with a mother who worked her fingers raw and a father who drank away anything extra. His younger sister Lily had died at 6 years old from pneumonia. They could not afford the doctor. His mother held Lily through the fever, singing hymns until the singing was the only sound left. Vance left home at 15. He worked cattle drives, saved every cent, swore he would never be poor again. He had succeeded, but success had cost nobody mention. It built walls as sturdy as wealth. It taught a man to need nothing because needing led to losing and losing was unbearable. He returned to his chair and picked up a book he was not really reading. Outside, the wind howled against windows that kept it out but could not keep out the loneliness. And somewhere 15 miles away, a child was about to write a letter that would change everything. Back in the cabin, Tinsley coughed again. Carla rose from the table and moved to the bed, sitting on the edge. She placed her hand on her daughter's back, feeling the small body shake with effort. "Mama," Tinsley whispered when the coughing stopped, "do you think Santa Claus knows where we live?" Carla's throat tightened. She swallowed hard before answering. "I think he knows where everyone lives, sweetheart. Even out here." "Even out here," Tinsley repeated, like she was testing the words. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "If I asked him for something, would he bring it?" "You can ask him for anything you want." "Not toys," Tinsley said seriously. "Something better." Carla stroked her daughter's hair. "What is better than toys?" But Tinsley had already closed her eyes. Exhaustion pulled her under before she could answer. Carla sat there in the darkness for a long time. She listened to her daughter breathe. She listened to the wind teach its lessons without mercy. Tomorrow she would wash clothes until her hands cracked and bled. She would smile at customers who did not see her as a person, just a service. She would count coins and stretch them impossibly far. She would come home and check Tinsley's breathing and pray the cough did not worsen. She would survive. Because survival was all she knew how to do. But she was so very tired of being strong alone. The trading post in Clement Springs served as the settlement's heartbeat. Every Tuesday and Friday, people came from outlying ranches and cabins to buy supplies, collect mail, and exchange news that traveled faster than telegraph lines. The building itself was weathered gray wood with a porch that sagged in the middle, but inside it smelled like coffee, leather, and possibility. Carla entered on a Friday morning in late November with Tinsley's hand clasped firmly in hers. She had delivered laundry to 3 households that morning and earned enough to buy cornmeal, molasses, and perhaps, if the price was right, a small jar of honey for Tinsley's cough. The post was crowded despite the cold. Ranchers talked about cattle prices near the stove. Women examined fabric bolts they could not afford. Children pressed their noses against candy jars filled with peppermints and licorice. Carla moved through them like water around stones, not drawing attention, not seeking it. She was examining cornmeal prices, calculating whether she could stretch a smaller bag longer, when Tinsley tugged her hand. "Mama, look." Carla followed her daughter's gaze to the counter where a man stood settling his account with the shopkeeper. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy wool coat and work gloves that looked expensive but well-used. Dark hair visible beneath his hat. Strong jaw. The kind of face that made women look twice. But Carla had trained herself not to notice such things. She had learned that looking led to hoping, and hoping led to disappointment. Tinsley had no such caution. "Hello," she said brightly, stepping forward before Carla could stop her. The man glanced down. His expression shifted from businesslike to something softer. Curious, almost gentle. Well, hello there. I am Tinsley. I am 5 years old. My mama does the best laundry in Montana Territory. Carla felt heat climb her neck. Tinsley, do not bother the man. She is no bother, he said. His voice was deep, unhurried. He looked at Carla properly then, and she saw gray eyes that seemed accustomed to measuring things accurately. Vance Gilmore. I own the Double G Ranch northeast of here. Carla knew the name. Everyone did. The Gilmore Ranch was the largest in the territory. This man was wealthy beyond anything she could imagine. Carla Welch, she said carefully, and I apologize for my daughter's forwardness. Do not apologize for friendliness. It is rare enough. He paused, then addressed Tinsley again with genuine interest. 5 years old. That is a good age. How old are you? Tinsley asked. Carla's mortification deepened. Tinsley. Manners. But Vance smiled. An actual smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. 34. And apparently old enough that children ask about it. That is not old, Tinsley said seriously. My papa was 28 when he died, and Mama says that was too young. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Carla's hand tightened on Tinsley's shoulder. We should finish our shopping. But something had shifted in Vance's expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of grief he knew too well. Of course, he said quietly. Good day, Mrs. Welch. She nodded once and steered Tinsley toward the cornmeal, her heart beating too fast for reasons she did not want to examine. Behind her, she heard Vance exchange a few more words with the shopkeeper. Then the door opened and closed, and he was gone. I liked him, Tinsley announced. He did not talk to me like I was stupid. That was kind of him, Carla said carefully. But we do not speak to strangers like old friends, understand? He is not a stranger anymore. I know his name. Carla did not have the energy to argue with 5-year-old logic. She completed her purchases, counting coins twice to be certain, and left the trading post with Tinsley chattering about the candy jars she had seen but knew better than to ask for. 3 days later, Carla was hauling water from the creek when she noticed something strange. Fresh firewood, stacked beside her cabin. Not a small amount either, enough to last 2 weeks if she was careful. She set down the buckets and stared at it. She had not ordered firewood. She could not afford firewood. The only reason they had any at all was because she gathered scraps herself, spending hours in the woods searching for fallen branches and dead timber. Inside the cabin, Tinsley was wrapped in a blanket, drawing pictures on a slate. Did someone come by today? Carla asked. No, Mama. I have been inside all day, like you said. Carla returned to the porch and examined the wood more closely. It was good quality, split clean, stacked neatly by someone who knew what they were doing. No note, no explanation. She stood there in the cold for a long time. Pride warred with practicality inside her chest. She should find out who left it. She should assist on paying. She should protect what remained of her dignity. But she needed the wood desperately, and whoever had left it clearly had not wanted credit or thanks. Finally, she carried an armload inside and fed the fire. She watched the flames catch strong and steady. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from the cold. Someone had noticed them. Someone had helped without asking permission or demanding gratitude. She did not know whether to feel grateful or humiliated. The following week, Carla took Tinsley to the Stein Ranch to deliver laundry. The spread was impressive. Whitewashed buildings, corrals full of horses, a main house that spoke of established wealth. Mrs. Stein met her at the kitchen door, examined the folded linens with an eagle eye, and paid in coins that clinked satisfyingly in Carla's pocket. As she was leaving, leading Tinsley by the hand toward the wagon road, she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned to see Vance Gilmore riding in on a bay horse that looked expensive even to her untrained eye. He dismounted near the barn where 2 of the Stein ranch hands waited. Business from the looks of it. Then he noticed her. He tipped his hat. Mrs. Welch? Mr. Gilmore. Tinsley waved enthusiastically. Hello. Do you have any little girls? Carla wanted the earth to open and swallow her whole. Tinsley, manners. But Vance approached, leading his horse. No, I do not. Just me and a house too big for one person. We have a house too small for 2 people, Tinsley said. But Mama makes it work. I am sure she does. He glanced at Carla, and she saw something in his expression she could not quite name. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. Cold day for a long walk, he said. We manage, Carla replied, more sharply than she intended. He did not flinch. I am sure you do. Still, if you ever need a ride somewhere, my foreman makes this route twice weekly. We do not accept charity, Mr. Gilmore. Was not offering charity. Was offering efficiency. But suit yourself? He tipped his hat again and led his horse toward the barn without looking back. Carla stood there feeling foolish and defensive in equal measure. Tinsley looked up at her. Mama, why were you sharp with him? I was not sharp. You were. You get sharp when you are scared. I am not scared of anything. I know, Tinsley said quietly. That is why it is scary when you are. They walked home in silence. That night, Carla lay awake listening to her daughter breathe and wondering why kindness from a stranger felt more dangerous than hardship from winter. Over the next 2 weeks, small things continued to appear at the cabin. A sack of oats near the chicken coop, a new bucket to replace the one with the cracked handle. Once she found a jar of real honey on the porch step, wrapped in brown paper with no note attached. Carla knew who was leaving them. She also knew she should confront him, demand he stop, protect what remained of her pride. But every time she decided to march to the Double G Ranch and tell Vance Gilmore to leave her alone, Tinsley would cough, or the wind would rattle the cabin walls, or she would look at her cracked, bleeding hands and the words would die unspoken. She told herself she would accept help just through winter. Come spring, she would find a way to pay him back. Come spring, she would stand on her own again. But part of her, a part she barely acknowledged even to herself, wondered what it might be like to stop standing alone entirely. Tinsley wrote the letter on a Sunday evening while Carla darned socks by lamplight. The child had asked for paper, which they rarely had. Carla hesitated, then tore a page from an old account book. Whatever Tinsley wanted to write was clearly important to her. Tinsley worked slowly, tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration, forming letters with the deliberation of someone still learning the shapes. Her handwriting was careful but uneven, the letters leaning this way and that, like flowers reaching for sunlight. Carla glanced over occasionally but did not pry. Children needed privacy for their thoughts the same as adults. When Tinsley finished it, she folded the paper carefully and drew on the outside 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one medium, one small. Above them, she had written in careful letters, "For Santa Claus." "That is lovely, sweetheart," Carla said. "What did you ask for?" "It is a secret." Tinsley's voice was solemn. "It only works if you do not tell." "Where did you hear that?" "I just know it." The next morning, Tinsley insisted on going to town. There was a wooden box outside the trading post where children left letters, believing them bound for the North Pole. In reality, the shopkeeper collected them at Christmas and read them aloud for community entertainment. A harmless tradition, the children never knew their secrets were shared. But children did not need to know that. Carla watched Tinsley slip the letter into the box with the solemnity of prayer. Her small hands lingered on the wood for a moment, as if transferring hope through touch. Whatever she had asked for, it mattered deeply. 3 days later, the letter ended up on Vance Gilmore's porch. It happened through simple accident and careless mix-up. The shopkeeper's nephew, a young man named Drew Austin, worked part-time delivering mail and supplies to outlying ranches. That particular day, he was running late and rushing through his rounds. He grabbed a stack of papers from behind the counter without checking them carefully. Invoices, notices, random correspondence. The letter had gotten mixed in with business documents meant for the Double G. When he reached the ranch, he left everything on the porch table where Vance collected papers each morning. Then he rode off to his next stop without a second thought. Vance found it the following day. He was sorting through the usual paperwork, a receipt for feed grain, a notice about a cattleman's meeting, when the childish handwriting caught his eye. Then the drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands. Then the words. He unfolded the paper slowly, curious but expecting nothing more than a child's wish for a doll or a pony. What he read stopped his heart. "Dear Santa, please send me a father. Not for me only, for Mama too. She works so hard and cries when she thinks I'm sleeping. Other children have fathers who fix things and carry heavy things. Mama does it all herself, and her hands hurt. I do not want toys. I want someone to make Mama smile like she used to. If you cannot send a father, then maybe send more firewood because it is cold. Thank you. Tinsley Welch, age 5. Vance read it 3 times. He stood on his porch with snow falling and a letter in his hands that felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. She works so hard and cries when she thinks I am sleeping. He remembered being 6 years old in a Wyoming shack, watching his mother work herself to shadows while his father drank, hearing her cry at night when she thought the children were asleep. Her hands hurt. He remembered his mother's hands, cracked and bleeding from washing clothes in winter creeks, red and raw from lye soap. He'd be on her years from work that never ended. Other children have fathers who fix things and carry heavy things. He remembered carrying water for his mother because there was no one else. Remembered trying to chop firewood with an axe too heavy for his small arms. Remembered feeling helpless in the face of need he could not fill. I want someone to make Mama smile like she used to. He remembered the last time his mother smiled, really smiled, before Lily died, before hope became something she could not afford. Vance sat down on the porch bench heavily. His legs did not seem to want to hold him up anymore. A child had written to Santa Claus asking for someone to lighten her mother's burden. Not toys, not candy, not anything for herself, just someone to help. And somehow, impossibly, the letter had landed in his hands. He sat there until the cold forced him inside. Even then, he carried the letter to his desk and placed it in the top drawer where he could see it every morning. He did not know what to do with it. He only knew he could not ignore it. That night, Vance dreamed of his sister for the first time in years. Lily was 6 again, laughing and running through fields that existed only in memory. Her dark hair flew behind her. Her gray eyes, so like his own, sparkled with joy she never got to keep. Then she started coughing. The dream shifted, became darker. She was lying in bed, her small body shaking. His mother was crying. The doctor was not coming because they could not pay. Vance woke gasping, his face wet with tears he did not remember crying. He lay in the darkness of his expensive bedroom in his expensive house and thought about a 5-year-old girl in a cabin 15 miles away. A girl who coughed, whose mother worked herself to breaking, whose letter had somehow found him. Maybe there were no accidents. Maybe some prayers really did find exactly who needed to hear them. The next morning, Vance rode to town before dawn. He found the shopkeeper opening up and asked a question that made the old man's eyebrows rise. He needed to know more about the Welch widow. What he learned confirmed everything the letter had told him and more. Thomas Welch had been a dreamer, good-hearted but impractical. He left his wife with nothing but a leaky cabin and a child too young to help. Carla had been surviving ever since, taking any work she could find, refusing charity with a pride that bordered on self-destruction, walking miles in weather that kept other people indoors, working until her hands bled. She was stubborn, the shopkeeper said, too stubborn for her own good. Someone offered to help her last winter, and she almost bit his head off, said she did not need anyone's pity. Vance nodded slowly. That matched what he had seen. The sharpness when he offered a ride, the defensive way she carried herself, the walls she had built to protect whatever dignity remained. She did not want pity, neither did he, but maybe she would accept partnership. Maybe she would accept an arrangement that gave her something she needed without taking her pride. He spent the ride home planning. By the time he reached the Double G, he knew exactly what he would offer: legitimate work, fair wages, an arrangement that would put her in his orbit without making her feel like charity. And maybe, if he was lucky, she would let him be what that letter asked for. Not because she needed saving, but because everyone deserves someone to share the weight. 2 days later, Carla encountered Vance at the trading post again. She had just finished haggling with the shopkeeper over the price of lamp oil when she turned and nearly collided with him. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her. The touch was brief, but warm even through her coat. "Mrs. Welch, Mr. Gilmore." She stepped back quickly. "Forgive me. I was not watching where I was going. No harm done." He held a list in his other hand. Ranch supplies from the look of it. His expression was careful but warm. "How is your daughter?" Carla blinked, surprised he remembered. Surprised he cared enough to ask. "Her cough is improving." "Some. The cold does not help." "No, it does not." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully before speaking. "My housekeeper makes an excellent mustard plaster. If you would like, I could have her prepare one. It helped my sister when she was young. The mention of his sister caught Carla off guard. It was the first personal detail he had offered, a crack in the careful reserve he maintained. That is kind of you, but I could not impose. No imposition, he interrupted gently, just an offer between neighbors. We are not exactly neighbors. Your ranch is 6 miles from my cabin. On the frontier, 6 miles counts as neighbors. He smiled slightly, and something about that smile made Carla's defenses waver. Besides, your daughter introduced herself to me. That makes us acquaintances at minimum. Despite herself, Carla felt her lips twitch toward a smile. She is very friendly. She is very brave. Like her mother. The compliment landed softly, without presumption or expectation. Carla found she had no defense against it. I am not brave, she said. I am just doing what must be done. That is the definition of brave. Vance shifted his weight, looking suddenly less certain of himself than Carla had ever seen him. Mrs. Welch, I hope I have not offended you with the firewood and such. I do not mean to imply you cannot manage. I just thought, well, everyone could use help sometimes. Carla studied him carefully. His face was open, sincere. No pity in his eyes, no superiority, just honest desire to help that asked nothing in return. You were the one leaving things, she said. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am, why? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like old pain. Because I know what it is like to be cold and scared and too proud to ask for help. And because if someone had helped my mother when I was young, maybe things would have been different. The honesty in his voice stripped away Carla's defenses like wind stripping leaves from trees. Mr. Gilmore? Vance, please. She hesitated. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way she was not prepared for. Vance, she amended. I appreciate the kindness, truly, but I cannot accept charity without giving something in return. It is not pride, it is self-respect. He nodded slowly. I understand that. What if we made it a trade? A trade? You are the best laundress in the territory, according to your daughter anyway. I need someone to handle the ranch house linens. My housekeeper is getting too old for the heavy washing. If you would take on that work, I would pay you fair wages. The firewood and supplies would just be part of the arrangement. Carla's mind raced through the implications. The work would be steady, the pay reliable. It would mean regular trips to his ranch, but she could bring Tinsley with her. More importantly, it was legitimate employment, not charity. How much laundry are we discussing? Bed linens, table linens, personal items, once weekly, maybe twice during busy seasons. And the pay? He named a figure that was more than fair. It was generous without being insulting, enough to make a real difference without making her feel bought. Carla did quick calculations in her head. With that income, she could afford better food, warmer clothes for Tinsley, perhaps even save a little for emergencies. I would need to bring my daughter, she said. Of course, the house has plenty of space. She could play inside where it is warm. Carla extended her hand before she could talk herself out of it. Then we have an agreement. Vance shook it. His grip was firm and warm. His calluses matched her own. I am glad, he said. When can you start? Next week. Perfect. Come Tuesday. I will make sure the housekeeper knows to expect you. As Carla left the trading post with Tinsley, she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not quite hope. She was not ready for that yet, but perhaps the beginning of something like possibility. Tuesday arrived cold and clear. Carla bundled Tinsley in every warm thing they owned and made the walk to the Double G Ranch. Vance had offered to send his foreman with the wagon, but she declined. She could still walk 6 miles. She was not helpless yet. By the time they arrived, her legs ached and Tinsley's cheeks were bright red from the cold. But they had made it. Vance met them at the door. His expression was warm with welcome. Come in, get by the fire. He ushered them into the main room where heat poured from a massive stone fireplace. The warmth wrapped around Carla like an embrace after the bitter cold outside. Mrs. Erickson, my housekeeper, has hot tea ready. An older woman with kind eyes appeared, carrying a tray. You must be frozen through. Sit, dear, and this must be Tinsley. Tinsley was too busy staring around the room to respond immediately. The house was enormous compared to their cabin. Furniture gleamed with polish. Rugs softened the floors. Books lined shelves that reached to the ceiling. Windows let in light that their single cabin window could never match. It was like stepping into a different world. "It is very big," Tinsley finally said. Her voice held wonder rather than envy. Vance crouched to her level, putting himself at her height rather than towering over her. "It is it not? Too big for just me. You know what helps?" "What?" "Having visitors. Makes it feel less empty." He straightened and addressed Carla. "The laundry room is through here. Mrs. Erickson will show you everything. Take your time getting familiar with where things are." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of learning, where the linens were kept, how Vance preferred things folded, what needed special care. The facilities were far superior to what Carla had at the cabin. Hot water from an actual boiler, good soap, a drying room that meant she would not have to freeze hanging clothes outside. It was more than adequate. It was wonderful. When she emerged, she found Tinsley sitting at the kitchen table with Vance. Both of them bent over a book, heads close together. He was reading to her, his deep voice gentle and unhurried, giving each word its proper weight. Tinsley was hanging on every word, her face lit with the joy of stories. Carla's chest tightened at the sight. Thomas had read to Tinsley like that. She had forgotten how much her daughter missed it, how much they both did. Vance looked up and smiled when he saw her. "I hope you do not mind." She asked about the books. "I do not mind," Carla said softly. "Thank you, my pleasure." He closed the book carefully, marking the place. "How was the laundry room?" "More than adequate. I can have everything ready by Thursday if I start the washing tomorrow." "No rush. Take the time you need." He stood, then seemed to hesitate. Something he wanted to say, but was not sure he should. "Mrs. Welch." Carla. Her name and his voice did something strange to her heartbeat. "I hope this arrangement works well for both of us, and I hope you will feel comfortable here. This house could use more life in it." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. He was not just being polite, he meant it. The loneliness she had sensed at the trading post was more evident here, in his too large house with its 2 quiet rooms. In the way he looked at Tinsley like she was something precious, simply because she filled the silence. "I think it will work well," she said. And for the first time in 2 years, she believed it. 2 days later, Carla returned to complete the washing. This time, Vance was working in his study when they arrived, but he emerged to greet them. Tinsley immediately asked if they could read another story later, and he agreed without hesitation. Carla worked efficiently, finding satisfaction in good equipment and quality linens. She was folding the last of the bed sheets when she heard raised voices from outside. She moved to the window and saw chaos unfolding in the yard. Vance was attempting to load a stubborn bull into a pen with help from 2 ranch hands. The animal was having none of it. She watched Vance grab a rope, plant his feet, and pull. The bull pulled back. Vance held firm, muscles straining, hat falling off unnoticed. For a moment, it looked like he would succeed. Then the bull decided cooperation was finished. It yanked sideways. The rope slipped, and Vance went down hard into a patch of mud that had thawed in the morning sun. He landed flat on his back with a splash that sent mud flying in all directions. The ranch hands rushed to help him up, but Vance waved them off. He sat there for a moment, looking down at himself in disbelief. Then he started laughing. Carla found herself smiling despite her intention to remain professional. She returned to her folding, but when Vance came inside 20 minutes later, cleaned up but still damp, she could not help commenting. "I saw your wrestling match with the bull." He grimaced. "I had hoped that went unwitnessed." The bull won decisively. "Thank you for that assessment." He poured himself coffee, his movements carrying the wounded dignity of a man whose pride had taken a beating. "In my defense, he outweighs me by several hundred pounds." Poor excuse. He looked at her, surprised by the teasing in her voice. Then he grinned. "I suppose it is. I will do better next time." "See that you do. Your reputation demands it." They were flirting. Carla realized it with a start. The back and forth felt natural, playful, dangerous. She should stop. She should return to work. She should remember her place. But Vance was looking at her with warmth in his gray eyes, and she found she did not want to stop. "You have mud on your ear," she said. He reached up, found it, wiped it away. "Better?" "Other ear." He switched ears. "Now?" You are terrible at this, clearly. He leaned against the counter, abandoning dignity entirely. Should I just assume I am covered in mud and give up? Carla set down her folding and crossed to him before she could think better of it. She reached up and wiped a smudge from his jaw with her thumb. The touch lasted half a second, but awareness sparked between them like lightning before thunder. She stepped back quickly. There! Presentable again. Thank you, he said quietly. His eyes locked on hers. The moment stretched, filled with things neither was ready to say. Mama, Tinsley called from the other room. Can we read now? The spell broke. Carla turned away, grateful for the interruption and devastated by it in equal measure. I should finish. Of course. Vance cleared his throat. I will see to Tinsley. As he left, Carla pressed her hands against the counter and tried to slow her breathing. She could not afford this. Could not afford to feel attracted to a wealthy rancher who was kind to her daughter and looked at her like she was more than just tired hands and faded dresses. But she did feel it. Heaven help her. She did. The following week, during her third visit to the ranch, disaster struck in the form of Carla's attempt at gratitude. She had baked bread the night before, determined to bring something to show appreciation for the generous employment. The bread looked acceptable when she wrapped it. She had not tested it. That was her mistake. She presented it to Vance at midday when Mrs. Erickson was visiting her sister in town. I brought you something to say thank you for the work. Vance's face brightened. You did not have to do that. He unwrapped it, examining the loaf. It looks wonderful. I am not much of a baker, Carla warned. But I tried. He cut a slice. The knife resisted. He pressed harder. The knife stopped completely. Stuck halfway through. He wiggled it free and tried again, finally managing to cut a piece that could have been used as a doorstop. Carla watched with growing horror as he bit into it. His jaw muscles worked. His eyes widened slightly. He chewed slowly, determinedly, like a man fulfilling a solemn oath. It is, he began, still chewing. Terrible, Carla finished, mortified beyond words. I was going to say dense. That is a kind word for terrible. He finally swallowed with visible effort and reached for water. It has character. It has the texture of saddle leather. I have eaten saddle leather. He paused, considered. Softer than this, he admitted, then immediately looked apologetic. But Carla was laughing. She could not help it. The humiliation was so complete, his determination to be polite so obvious. That laughter was the only possible response. I am a terrible cook. You are an excellent laundress, he offered. That is not the same thing. It is better. Clean shirts matter more than bread. He examined the loaf again with exaggerated seriousness. Though this could be useful for other purposes. Propping doors, weighing down papers, self-defense. Tinsley appeared in the doorway. Mama, did you give him the bread? I did. And he ate it? He tried. Tinsley looked at Vance with new respect. If you survive Mama's bread, you can survive busting. Vance laughed, deep and genuine. The sound filled the kitchen with warmth. Your daughter is wise beyond her years, he said. She is practical, Carla corrected, still smiling. I will stick to doing laundry from now on. A good plan. He set the bread aside carefully. But I appreciate the thought. Truly, the thought was better than the execution. Most things are. They stood there grinning at each other like fools. And Carla realized with sudden clarity that she was in trouble. She liked him. Not just appreciated his kindness or respected his position. She actually liked him. His humor, his gentleness, his willingness to make himself look foolish rather than hurt her feelings. That was the most dangerous thing of all. Later that afternoon, while Carla was nearly finished with the day's work, she heard a tremendous crash from outside, followed by startled squawking. She rushed to the window and saw chaos. The chicken coop gate had come open. Birds were everywhere, flapping and running and making noise enough to wake the dead. Vance was trying to round them up with help from Tinsley, who had gone outside to explore. But chickens, Carla knew from experience, were smarter than they looked and more stubborn than mules. She ran outside. Tinsley, did you open that gate? I wanted to help feed them, Tinsley said, looking guilty. And now we are helping chase them. That we are, Vance said, making a lunge for a particularly fast hen. He missed, nearly fell. The chicken squawked triumphantly and darted away. Carla grabbed at another bird and caught only feathers. The chicken ran between her legs. She spun, her skirt tangling, and would have fallen if Vance had not caught her arm. "We are being defeated by poultry," he said. "Speak for yourself." Carla hiked up her skirt, abandoning modesty for practicality, and went after the nearest hen with determination. She cornered it against the barn. Dove. Caught it. The bird struggled. She held firm. Marched it back to the coop. Deposited it inside. "Victorious. One down," Vance called. Approximately 15 to go. The next 20 minutes were pure chaos. Tinsley managed to lure 3 back by talking to them sweetly. Vance caught 2 more despite their best efforts to humiliate him. Carla cornered another 4. By the end, they were all breathing hard, covered in feathers and dust, and laughing too hard to stand upright. Vance collapsed against the barn wall, his back against weathered wood, his chest heaving. "I have negotiated with cattlemen. Survived blizzards, broken wild horses, but chickens might be what finally defeats me." Carla sat beside him, too exhausted to care about propriety. "They have no respect for authority or dignity." He picked a feather out of her hair. "You have battle scars, so do you." She plucked a feather from his shirt collar. Their eyes met, both still smiling, and the laughter faded into something else, something charged, breathless. Vance's hand was still near her face from removing the feather. Carla's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Mama, Mr. Gilmore!" Tinsley's voice cut through the moment. "I found the last one." They both looked away quickly, clearing throats, straightening clothes. Vance stood first, offered Carla his hand. She took it, let him pull her up, tried to ignore how warm his palm felt against hers. "We make a good team," he said quietly. "Against chickens, maybe. It is a start." That night, lying in bed beside Tinsley, Carla admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling for Vance Gilmore. Not the careful, practical interest of a woman looking for security, but actual, terrifying, emotional falling. She did not know what to do about it, did not know if he felt the same, did not know if a wealthy rancher could truly want a poor widow with rough hands and a bread recipe that could be weaponized. But she knew she could not go back to pretending she felt nothing. Winter had taught her many lessons. Maybe it was time to learn one more. That sometimes accepting help meant accepting hope too. 2 days later, during Carla's next visit, Vance asked if she would like tea after finishing the laundry. Not unusual, Mrs. Erickson often made tea. But this time, Mrs. Erickson had already left for the day. It was just Vance making the offer. "I do not want to impose," Carla said. "You are not. I am asking." So she sat at his kitchen table while he made tea badly. Too strong, not enough sugar. And they talked, really talked, about her childhood in a farming family in Iowa, about his years on cattle drives, learning the business from the ground up, about books they had read, dreams they had before life got complicated. "I wanted to be a teacher once," Carla admitted. "Before I married Thomas, I loved reading, learning. But women do not have many choices." "You could teach now," Vance said. "If you wanted. I do not have the training. You have the intelligence. The rest can be learned." She looked at him, surprised. "You think I could?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to." He said it simply, like it was an obvious fact not worth debating. Carla felt her throat tighten. Thomas had loved her, but he had never seen her as capable beyond domestic duties, never imagined she could be more than what she was. Vance looked at her like she had potential beyond survival. "What about you?" she asked. "What did you dream of?" He was quiet for a moment. A family, a house full of children and noise, someone to share things with. He smiled ruefully. "Not very ambitious compared to yours. It is not less important." "No, but it feels further away. I thought I would have it by now. You are only 34, old enough to know what I want, young enough to hope it is not too late." Their eyes met across the table. And Carla knew they were not just talking about abstract dreams anymore. They were talking about specific possibilities, about futures that might include each other. "It is not too late," she said quietly. "For either of us? For either of us." Vance reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, gentle on her work-roughened skin. Carla, I need to tell you something. Her heart hammered. All right, I read your daughter's letter. The one to Santa. Carla froze. What? It ended up on my porch by accident, mixed in with ranch papers. He tightened his grip on her hand when she tried to pull away. Please, let me finish. She stopped struggling, but did not relax. She asked Santa to send her a father, Vance said, not for toys, for someone to help her mother, someone to make you smile again. His voice was thick with emotion. Carla, I know what it is like to be that child. Watching a parent break themselves trying to survive. My sister died because we could not afford help. My mother worked herself into an early grave, and I swore if I ever had the means, I would never let someone suffer like that if I could prevent it. Tears pricked Carla's eyes. So this was pity. All of it. Everything he had done. The firewood, the kindness. All because he felt sorry for her. No, his voice was firm. It started as wanting to help, but it became something else. He stood and came around the table, knelt beside her a chair. It became admiration for your strength, affection for your daughter's bright spirit. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with a woman who bakes bread that could stop bullets and fights chickens with dignity and makes me laugh for the first time in years. Carla stared at him, unable to breathe. You are in love with me? Completely. Hopelessly. He smiled nervously. Is that terribly presumptuous? She thought about how many times she had found excuses to look at him. How her heart lifted when she saw his ranch appear on the horizon. How safe she felt in his presence. How Tinsley had blossomed under his attention. How empty the cabin felt now compared to the warmth of his house. Not if I feel the same way, she whispered. His eyes widened. Do you? Instead of answering, she cupped his face in her hands and kissed him. It was nothing like the chaste, careful touches they had shared before. This was months of restrained want finally released. His hands came to her waist, pulling her closer. She threaded her fingers through his hair, knocking her chair aside as she slid down to his level. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, Vance pressed his forehead to hers. Dear Santa, please send me a father, he quoted softly. Best letter I ever received. Carla laughed through tears. My daughter is wiser than both of us. She knew what you needed before you did. What we both needed. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring. Stay for dinner, he murmured against her lips. Stay longer. Stay forever. She pulled back slightly. Forever, I was going to say as long as you want. But forever works too. From the doorway, Tinsley's voice made them both jump. Are you kissing? Carla pulled back, flushed. Tinsley, how long have you been there? Long enough to know Santa is real. Tinsley grinned, and that he looks like Mr. Gilmore. Vance laughed and stood, helping Carla to her feet. Come here, you clever girl. Tinsley ran to them, and Vance scooped her up. She wrapped her arms around his neck and said solemnly, Does this mean you will be my papa? Vance looked at Carla, who nodded through tears. If that is all right with you, he said to Tinsley. I would be honored. It is all right with me. She hugged him tighter. I asked for you specially. Then I better do a good job. You already are. And standing in that warm kitchen with snow falling outside and the three of them wrapped together, Carla finally understood what hope felt like. After years of just surviving, December brought cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. Tinsley's cough, which had improved briefly, returned with vengeance. By the second week of the month, she was feverish, struggling to breathe, her small body shaking with coughs that seemed to tear her apart from inside. Carla was terrified. She tried everything she knew. Steam treatments, willow bark tea, poultices on the chest. Nothing helped. Tinsley grew weaker daily. Vance had asked her to marry him the week before. After courting her properly with rides around his property, dinners at his house, and careful conversations about their future, she had said yes without hesitation. Her heart full of certainty. They planned to marry in the spring, but now spring seemed impossibly distant. And all that mattered was Tinsley's labored breathing. On the fourth night, Carla broke. She wrapped Tinsley in every blanket they owned, lifted her. God, she weighed nothing, and carried her through darkness toward the one place she knew could help. The Double G Ranch was 6 miles away. Carla walked them with Tinsley whimpering against her shoulder. her own tears freezing on her cheeks, the cold biting through every layer she wore. She did not care about pride anymore. She cared about breathing, about her daughter's breath continuing past this night. She reached the ranch house near midnight. Lamplight showed in the windows. Vance was still awake. She stumbled up the porch steps and pounded on the door with her fist, shouting his name. The door opened. Vance stood there in a loose shirt and trousers, barefoot, hair disheveled from sleep he had been attempting. His expression shifted instantly when he saw them. "She cannot breathe," Carla said, her voice breaking. "I tried everything. I do not know what else to do." He did not ask questions. He lifted Tinsley from Carla's arms with infinite care and carried her inside to a room with a fire already burning. He laid her on a sofa and examined her quickly, his hands gentle but certain. "How long has she been like this?" "4 days, getting worse." "You should have come sooner." "I know." Carla was shaking now, exhaustion and fear and cold all hitting at once. Vance looked at her. "Sit down before you fall down. I will handle this." For the first time in 2 years, Carla obeyed someone without question. She sank into a chair and watched him work. He boiled water, created a steam tent with blankets, held Tinsley upright so her lungs could drain, rubbed her back in slow, firm circles. He moved with competence that spoke of experience, and something about that steadiness allowed Carla's terror to loosen just slightly. Hours passed, Tinsley's breathing eased. The fever broke near dawn. She fell into real sleep, her small hand curled against Vance's chest where he sat holding her. Carla finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "How did you know what to do?" Vance did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Tinsley. "I had a sister, Lily. She died when I was 12. Pneumonia. We could not afford the doctor, could not afford medicine." His voice was flat, controlled, hiding old pain that had never fully healed. "My mother did everything you did. Steam, tea, prayers. It was not enough." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. "I am sorry," Carla whispered. "I swore after that I would never be helpless again. I learned everything I could about treating illness, about medicines, about what works and what does not." He finally looked at her. His eyes held old pain and new determination. "Your daughter will not die because you could not afford help. Not while I am breathing." Carla felt something crack open inside her chest. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "Because I know what it is like to watch someone you love die from poverty." He paused. "And because a little girl wrote a letter asking Santa for someone to lighten her mother's burden. Maybe I am not Santa, but I can try to be what she asked for." The space between them felt charged with things neither could name. Carla stood and crossed to where he sat. She knelt beside the sofa, her face level with his. "I am sorry I did not come sooner," she said quietly. "I am sorry I let pride nearly cost my daughter her life. Pride keeps people alive sometimes. It kept you standing when most would have broken. It also keeps people alone." He held her gaze. "You are not alone anymore. You will never be alone again if I have anything to say about it." Carla reached out slowly and placed her hand over his where it rested on Tinsley's back. His hand was warm, calloused, real. "I do not know how to do this," she admitted. "I do not know how to let someone help without feeling like I am failing." "You are not failing. You are surviving something that would have destroyed weaker people. I am tired of just surviving." "Then stop." His voice was gentle but firm. "Stop carrying everything alone. Let me help. Let me be what that letter asked for. Not because you need saving, but because everyone deserves a partner." Tears spilled down Carla's face, silent and cleansing. "What if I cannot be what you need? You already are." He reached up and brushed tears from her cheeks. "You are strong and kind and brave. You are an excellent mother. You make me laugh. You challenge me. You make this house feel like a home just by being in it. What more could I possibly need?" She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and grateful and full of emotion too big for words. When she pulled back, she whispered, "I love you. I love you too." He brushed more tears from her cheeks. "Now rest. Let me keep watch." So she curled up in the chair beside them and let herself sleep, knowing someone else was standing guard. Tinsley woke at noon, groggy but breathing easily. She looked around the unfamiliar room with confusion, then saw Vance and smiled. Did Santa send you? Something like that. I told Mama he would. Carla, who had been dozing in the chair, woke fully. How do you feel, sweetheart? Hungry. And Mr. Gilmore's house smells like bacon. Vance laughed. I think that can be arranged. He made them breakfast. Actual eggs, bacon, toast with butter. Carla watched him move around the kitchen with easy competence and felt something stir alongside gratitude. Not just physical want, though that was there, but wanting partnership, wanting shared burdens, wanting someone to look at her daughter with protective affection. After breakfast, he insisted they stay at the ranch until Tinsley was fully recovered. Carla protested weakly, but Vance simply showed them to a guest room with a bed big enough for both of them and clean sheets that smelled like lavender. Rest, he said. Actually rest. The world will not end if you stop carrying it for a few days. That afternoon, while Tinsley slept peacefully, Vance took Carla aside. I want to move the wedding up. She blinked. What? I do not want to wait until spring. I want you here, where I can make sure you are both safe and warm, where Tinsley has access to proper medicine if she needs it, where you do not have to walk 6 miles in snow to do laundry. He took her hands. I want you to be my wife, now, as soon as possible. People will talk. They will say we rushed. Let them talk. I do not care about gossip. I care about you and Tinsley. His voice was fierce. I almost lost her last night. I will not risk that again. Carla's heart swelled. You really want this? More than anything? Then yes, let us not wait. He pulled her into his arms and held her like she was something precious. Finally found after a long search. They married 3 weeks later in the small church in Clement Springs. The ceremony was simple, no grand affair, just the minister. A few friends, Mrs. Erickson dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and Tinsley standing between them, holding both their hands. Vance promised to love, protect, and partner with Carla. She promised the same. And when he kissed his bride, Tinsley cheered loud enough to make the whole congregation laugh. I told you Santa was real, she announced proudly. They moved into the ranch house that week. Carla walked through rooms that had echoed with loneliness and began filling them with life. She hung curtains, arranged furniture, claimed spaces as her own. Tinsley ran through hallways, shouting to hear her echo, delighted by the sheer size of her new home. Mrs. Erickson stayed on as housekeeper, but Carla took over most of the cooking. Except bread, that Vance would handle from now on. They fell into rhythms that felt natural, breakfast together, work during the day, Tinsley's lessons in the afternoon, dinner as a family, evenings by the fire, reading, talking, simply being together. And at night in the bedroom they now shared, Vance made love to his wife with devotion that grew deeper with familiarity. Tell me what you want, he murmured against her skin one night. You, she whispered back. Always you. He gave her exactly that, passion expressed through touch, through whispered words, through careful attention to her pleasure. Carla discovered that desire did not die with hardship. It only waited for safety to return. 6 weeks after the wedding, Tinsley climbed into Vance's lap while he read the newspaper. Can I call you Papa? His throat tightened visibly. You can call me anything you want, sweetheart. I want to call you Papa, because that is what you are. He held her close and blinked back tears. Then Papa it is. Carla watched from the doorway, one hand resting lightly on her stomach. Nothing showing yet, but her heart already knew. She had not told him. She wanted the moment to be perfect. That night in bed, she took his hand and placed it on her belly. We are having a baby. Vance went very still. You are certain? Yes. He pulled her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. She felt him trembling. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for choosing this, for choosing me, for giving me a family. We are building it together, she corrected gently. This is ours. Ours, he repeated, like a vow. Their son was born in late autumn during the first snow. The labor was hard, but Carla was strong. When the baby finally arrived, Vance held him with shaking hands and wept openly. No shame, no restraint, just pure, overwhelming joy. They named him Ellis after Carla's father. Tinsley took to being a big sister with fierce protectiveness. She helped change him, sang to him, insisted on holding him every chance she got. The house filled with baby sounds, crying, cooing, the soft noises of new life. One afternoon, while Ellis napped and Tinsley played outside, Carla found Vance in the nursery, just watching their son sleep. "You are going to spoil him," she said gently. "Probably." He did not look away from Ellis. "I keep thinking about my father, how he wasted what he had, how he chose drink over us, and I swear every day I will not make those mistakes." Carla wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You will not. You are nothing like him." "How do you know?" "Because you choose love. Every single day you choose us. That is what makes the difference." He turned in her arms and kissed her deeply. "I love you, all of you. This life we are building, we love you too." The ranch prospered over the next few years. Vance expanded the herds, purchased additional land, built a second barn. But more importantly, he brought Carla into the business as a full partner. She had a head for numbers and a sharp eye for deals. Together, they made the Double G one of the most successful operations in Montana territory. Carla traded her rough work dresses for finer ones, though she never forgot where she came from. She hired help for the house, not to replace her efforts, but to allow time for things she never had time for before: reading, writing, simply resting. She also started teaching, not in a formal school, but offering lessons to children from outlying ranches whose parents could not afford private tutors. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and discovered she had a gift for it. Vance converted a room in their house into a small classroom. Twice a week, children would arrive for lessons. Tinsley helped sometimes, reading to the younger students, demonstrating arithmetic problems. She was 11 now, bright and confident, with her father's determination and her mother's kindness. 2 years after Ellis, their daughter arrived. They named her Lily, after Vance's sister. She had dark hair and gray eyes like her father, and a stubborn streak that made them both laugh. "She is going to be trouble," Vance said, cradling his tiny daughter. "She is going to be strong," Carla corrected. "Like her namesake. I like that better." Their bedroom remained a place of passion and intimacy. Marriage deepened their physical connection rather than dulling it. One night, Carla surprised him by appearing in the doorway of their bedroom wearing only his shirt. His eyes darkened immediately. "Mrs. Gilmore, are you trying to distract me from my reading? Is it working?" He set the book aside completely. She crossed to him slowly, enjoying the way his gaze tracked her movement. "Good." He pulled her onto his lap, his hands sliding under the shirt to find bare skin. "You are going to be the death of me," he murmured against her neck. But what a way to go. They made love with laughter and desire in equal measure. And afterward, wrapped in sheets and contentment, Carla thought she had never been happier. Vance stepped into fatherhood with steady competence. He taught Tinsley to ride, starting with a gentle mare named Clover and hours of patient instruction. He helped with her schoolwork, explaining an arithmetic in ways that made sense. He tucked her in at night, listened to her prayers, promised he was not going anywhere. He did the same with Ellis, then with Lily. 3 children who called him Papa. 3 children who never doubted they were loved. They had arguments, of course. Carla thought Vance pushed Ellis too hard sometimes. Vance worried Carla took on too much with her teaching. They disagreed about discipline, about money, about dozens of small things, but they always talked it through, always came back together, always remembered what they had survived to build this life. One evening, 14 years after their wedding, Vance found Carla in the small classroom organizing books. He leaned against the doorway, watching her. "What?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Just admiring my wife, after 14 years. Especially after 14 years. He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "You are even more beautiful than the day I married you. You are a terrible liar. I am completely serious." He kissed her temple. "You are happy. It shows." She leaned into him. "I am happy. Disgustingly, completely happy." Good. That was the plan. They stood there in comfortable silence, surrounded by books and the evidence of the life they had built. Carla sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the accident that brought them together, for the letter that changed everything, for the man who read a child's wish and decided to answer it. On a December evening, with snow falling soft and silent, 15 years after that first letter, Vance found it again. He was looking for ranch documents in his desk when his hand touched worn paper. He pulled it out, unfolded it carefully. The childish handwriting was faded now, the stick figures on the outside barely visible, but the words were still clear. Dear Santa, please send me a father. Carla appeared in the doorway. What are you reading? He held it up. The letter that changed everything. She crossed to him and read over his shoulder, smiling. She was very specific in her request. Smart girl. She is 20 now, getting married next summer to that Conrad boy. Do not remind me. But Vance smiled despite his words. Though I suppose if she had to choose someone, Dawson is a decent young man, and he worships her, as he should. Carla sat on the edge of his desk. Hard to believe a single piece of paper changed everything. He pulled her onto his lap. I would probably still be alone in this house. Pretending solitude was enough, and I would still be in that cabin. Pretending survival was the same as living. Thank God for accidents. Thank God for answered prayers, she corrected. From upstairs came the sounds of the younger children arguing. Ellis, now 13, and Lily, now 11, fighting over something trivial. Tinsley's voice cut through, calm and authoritative, settling the dispute. Vance stood, carrying Carla with him. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Where are we going? To remind our children that their parents are still very much in love. They know that. Let us make sure. He carried her upstairs, past the children's rooms, to their bedroom where lamplight glowed warm. He set her down gently and closed the door. Shutting out the world, they made love slowly, savoring every moment, every touch, every whispered word. Time had taught them patience. Experience had taught them what the other needed. And love, deep and abiding, made every touch meaningful. Later, wrapped together in the aftermath, Carla said softly, "Do you think she knew, when she wrote that letter?" Knew what? That Santa would be a lonely cowboy who needed saving just as much as we did. Vance was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. Maybe, or maybe she just believed hard enough that the universe paid attention. I'm glad it did. So am I. Every single day. On Christmas morning, the whole family gathered in the parlor. It had become tradition over the years. Everyone opening gifts together, chaos and laughter filling the house. Tinsley, now a young woman preparing for her own wedding, helped Ellis and Lily with their gifts. She had matured into someone remarkable. Kind, intelligent, confident. Exactly the person her childhood letter had hoped for. Vance and Carla sat together on the sofa, hands clasped. The house was warm. The fire burned bright. Outside, snow covered everything in forgiving white. Do you remember, Carla said quietly, when winter felt like punishment? I remember, Vance said. It feels different now, because we are not facing it alone anymore. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Thank you for reading that letter. Thank you for being brave enough to let me answer it. Tinsley looked over at them and smiled, the same smile she had worn as a 5-year-old girl, writing hope onto paper. She crossed to them and said quietly, I am glad you found each other. So are we, sweetheart. So are we. Ellis brought over a small wrapped package. Papa, this is for you and Mama, from all of us. Vance unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed copy of the original letter, carefully mounted and protected beneath glass, with a note added below in Tinsley's adult handwriting. The best prayer I ever wrote. Thank you both for proving that hope is not foolish. It is just patient. With love, Tinsley. Vance's eyes filled. He stood and pulled Tinsley into a fierce hug. Thank you for writing it, for giving me a chance to be your papa. Thank you for saying yes, she whispered back. The day passed in warmth and laughter. Dinner was abundant. Roasted turkey, potatoes, pie made from preserved apples, and all of Vance's excellent bread. The table was full, the conversation loud, the love so thick you could almost touch it. As evening fell and the children grew sleepy, Vance stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered ranch. Carla joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. What are you thinking? I spent years alone in this house, believing I preferred solitude. And then a letter arrived, and everything changed. He turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. I found you. I found us. I found out what home really means. She kissed him, soft and certain. Then I am glad you found us. I am glad you let yourself be found. Behind them, Tinsley began reading It Was the Night Before Christmas to her younger siblings, her voice clear and steady, just as Carla had read to her years ago in a cabin that no longer existed. The fire crackled. The house settled into evening peace. And if anyone had asked whether Vance Gilmore regretted answering a child's letter to Santa, the answer would have been written in every corner of that warm house. Every laugh from his children, every touch from his wife. Every morning he woke up knowing he was not alone. Some prayers get lost in the asking. Others land exactly where they are meant to. And when a man finally learns what love looks like, patient, chosen, built through shared struggle and honest partnership, he holds on with everything he has. Because losing a woman like Carla, a family like this, would be the kind of regret a man carries to his grave. But Vance Gilmore had no intention of finding out. He had everything he ever needed, wrapped in noise and warmth in letters written by hopeful children. And winter, for the first time in his life, felt like a blessing instead of a test. Carla pulled him away from the window. "Come on, let us join our family," he repeated, liking the sound of it. Yes, they returned to the warm circle of their children, and as snow continued falling outside, blanketing the world in white, the house glowed with light and love. A rancher who had been alone, a widow who had been struggling, a child who had been brave enough to ask for help, and a letter that found its way home. They say some prayers get lost in the asking, but this one arrived exactly where it needed to be and changed everything forever.